Welcome to our evaluation of evidence and how to do it. So what we're going to start off with today is just identifying what exactly we're doing. So right here, just basically evaluating how to evaluate the effectiveness of the evidence and is it valid basically. And then I'm going to go through quite quickly each piece of evidence means, why it is effective or not effective, and why the author employs it in a certain way or not a certain way in order to convey a certain message. Okay, so I'm going to quickly highlight everything real quick, like most pieces of evidence or most prominently present pieces of evidence that have the most dramatic role. And then after I do this, by the way, I'm going to annotate and explain why, of course. As you can see here, this is quite a large piece of evidence, and we're going to go into more here. This is all essentially evidence, and once we get to this part, I'm going to explain why he's developed it this way and has this much evidence in such a composed form or condensed form. Okay, condensed and composed actually. It's interesting to note also that he uses specific names of specific psychologists or what have you, various different types of specialists in whatever field it may be, and I'm going to explain a little bit further. This is probably going to be the last thing I cover, as it does weaken the thing the most, but it's really something he does more towards the end a little bit, and it's something that a lot of authors employ, and I'm going to explain why they do that. Alrighty, so let's cover the first piece of evidence. So the first piece of evidence lies within the first paragraph, and it states, in fact, the large-scale general survey of the United States found that from the early 1970s to the late 1990s, the percentage of people who are very happy actually dropped from 34% to 30%, despite higher incomes, more possessions, and improved living standards. Alright, so this is a piece of evidence because he provides, right here, a clear statistic in order to justify what he's stating. Alright, and so that's just basically creating a message of how he's supposedly presenting how the evidence justifies his claim, basically. It justifies his main claim here. It's not effective, and that's the number one rule we're going to go over here, is that they need to present a sense of justification of why it did, because if they don't, then it's not going to work. Okay, also he provides a timeline to create specificity. Actually, let me switch my pens because my pen isn't too good right now. Alright, so I switched pens. He provides a timeline here in which we're going to be clarifying that this is a 20-year span, and the issue with him just providing these 2 years is that it doesn't well, actually, that's good. Okay, that's actually a good piece of evidence because it introduces a valid statement that creates a idea of how it's in a specific time frame. And so what this does is it allows the audience to take away from it. We're specifically referencing this point. So these two things, this most importantly is pretty effective, but this can be deduced as effective piece of evidence because it presents a statistic survey that was carried out throughout the entirety of United States. So it is an effective survey. It's an effective piece of evidence because it presents something that is justified. It was completely done. You can look it up. So you can say, basically, you can just say it presents an accurate historical reference. One thing I want to touch on here is how authors use certain diction in order to induce an idea of what they're conveying, like what they want, what's the intended message of their said argument. Sorry about that. I didn't realize my camera cuts out at recording at 10 minutes on my phone, so I'm going to quickly go over what I was recording because I didn't even realize it. So we went to despite, basically develops why there's an issue with his argument, or it develops a personal implication. It just makes it so that he's really favoring his argument. That's all. The quotations here, they're almost doing the same thing, but what they do is they derive the information out of context completely. That's the issue with that. What he does is he introduces sociologist, which is a very broad application. And the issue with that is we're not sure who we're getting the information from, and so it creates an issue of justification. There's false justification here, and we don't know who this is from. The information could be false and invalid, so we can't really derive anything from that. So that's basically garbage. He continues in the next piece. This is essentially the same exact thing as citing sociologist in a broad application, Zygmunt Bauman. We have no idea who this dude is. I mean, he could be a random, pseudo name the guy made up because he felt like it. So we don't know who this is. That's what this annotation is here, and it doesn't give any real justification. It's impossible to derive who this guy is, and the information can't be validated. So simple as that. Says Bowman, that lacks justification, and it's essentially doing the same exact thing as these two things. Okay. When he says meant they, what meant they does is it puts it in his own context. It derives it out of what the context was that was initially implicated with what he previously states, but it basically places it in his own. So it's almost like taking a piece of apple pie from some guy's pie and putting it in your pumpkin pie because it's like you want to put it in your context. That's essentially what he's doing here, and that's an issue. Okay, so what he does here with these two grammatical points or punctuation points is something similar to this. It's another out of context issue here. Okay, that's the issue with that. Same exact thing, another quotation referral, presents it out of context, but what he does here is he does it to reinforce his argument more. He does this here in order to weaken what they're saying, but what he does here is he does it in order to strengthen what he's saying. So just remember that it can be used for the same method, but it'll help certain parts and harm certain parts counterintuitively almost. Additionally, he presents another diction usage here, and like I said, one of the biggest things authors like to do in order to strengthen their argument for the broadened audience is put in diction or put in certain terms that they feel as though will reinforce their thing, and it does. It makes it so people are for their argument rather than the counter-opposing argument, and that's what we're here to do. I don't know if I caught it in my first recording, but what we're here to do is identify those issues that are for the broad audience, analyze them, take it from an analytical standpoint, and identify that it's an issue and that it weakens his argument more than it strengthens it, and that it's really just here to make it so work for him. Okay, let's go to the next piece of evidence that's most notable. Yeah, like he says, greed is the backbone. That's another thing. I'm not going to even annotate it, but I'm just going to let you know right now it's the same thing as gluttonous. He could use some other thing. Greed is the, main part, of prevailing the philosophy stone. Again, he says prevailing. I mean, you could say so many other things. Just what he decides to say reinforce his argument and make it so it's better for him and not for the other. Okay. Again, same thing here with this little tiny quick claim or quote or what do you want to say, whatever you want to say. It is no wonder. Okay, again, just uses quotations placed in a certain point once more, but the others point out how greed and its dying with the most toys culture hero system is infusing, alright? Children around the globe with self-destructive degrees of materialism, viscerous preoccupation. Him presenting this in this context, or actually incorporating it in his own statement as something a writer would do, like someone that's literally writing an argument. He presents it, incorporating it, so he can say he didn't say it, but he really is saying it here. What he's saying, he incorporates it in his sentence in order to develop his sentence without a bias implication, so to speak. He's doing it in this manner, like with this certain manipulation, in order to be able to say that he didn't say that someone else did. Okay, so presents in a certain light through manipulation in order to say that he didn't say it, but it does reinforce his argument. This is a massive piece of evidence here, okay? And what we can deduce from an analytical standpoint, of course, right, is that he incorporates a massive piece of evidence. I mean, if you compare this to the rest of the argument, you can see that it's just a condensed mass of evidence that's just here to develop a sense of reinforcement in his argument. And that's essentially what he does here. He's incorporating all this evidence, supporting his argument, and possibly in points, I haven't read through it all entirely, supports, or it might harm the other argument. Okay, it might harm the opposing claims that, refute what he's arguing here. And so that's the issue with this massive piece of evidence. It presents a bias implication. And you might ask why, and like I just said, it's a massive condensed form at the very end of his argument, too. That's a very important citing here. At the very end of his argument, he presents all this evidence, helping his and harming the others, possibly another. And what that does is it creates almost this entire argument out of context. It harms the other argument so much so that one would not want to actually help that argument. And it creates a sense of how there's no real justification in this argument. It makes it so his argument, so to say, is better or superior to any other, and makes it so, does this here at the end so that it leaves the reader, the audience, with his argument in a very positive affliction. I mean, he could literally put certain pieces of evidence and end on something that has no bias implication or evidence in it, and would leave it as the audience to think about what they read. But instead, with this, all they're thinking about is all this evidence that reinforces his and harms the others. So it leaves the audience with a final thought on this part of the argument rather than the argument as a whole. Okay? So that's what we need to really just take away from this whole piece of evidence inclusion. So that's basically what we got here. Now let's go more in depth on what he does in this mass piece of evidence. So in this mass piece of evidence, let's go over more what he's got in here in order to reinforce or harm the opposition. Okay, so the commercialization of childhood, all the way to the end of it, his punctuation, lead the audience to believe what he's saying more. Like, leave him on a thought of his stuff. So essentially what the whole piece is doing here. When he states more and more, he doesn't provide any justification of that. He literally states that himself with nothing else supporting it at all. So, complete and utter biasness. When he says existing levels, it doesn't present any, like, more. It doesn't have a specificity. It's a massive, broadened range of application. And so, what the audience has to deduce in an analytical standpoint is that there's no support here. It's clearly introduced by himself, and he could be pulling this out of thin air. I mean, we could say that he is pulling this from somewhere, but we don't know that. So we have to deduce that he's just pulling this out of nowhere. I mean, we really can say that. And so that's an issue here, as it has no real support. When he states this quotation, it's interesting to note because usually quotations are used to place things out of context, but what he's doing here is he's placing something in its proper context, the term, and then providing a definition. So he says, so he provides a definition, and that's a true definition. You can tell, you can just see that he's including that just to reinforce his argument. So he does present this out of context, so you can say this is reinforcing his argument more, because you can see it's just a quick little line, like almost like a quick little jab to the other, benefit his argument. So you can say it's a sufficient piece of evidence. But what he does is he includes it in a biased light. He puts it in like a quick jab, like I said. Quick jab, so to speak, like I said. So that's the issue with this piece. He puts it out of context, the entire sentence. Some may think that's a little bit hard to do, but that's exactly what he's doing here. And one needs to be able to identify that. Because when it comes time to, citing certain pieces, you might think that, you read through the whole thing, that's pretty justified, but if you look at it as a whole sentence relating to the whole argument, and maybe even the counter-argument, one needs to continue to think throughout this whole thing as a counter-argument, because that really presents to you the effectiveness and how to evaluate the evidence. one needs to think, wow, could the whole sentence be placed in that certain spot? You need to think of sentence variation and their syntax, like how are they including it in their argument. You need to think that, because they do this on mass scale in order to reinforce their argument, but make it non-apparent to the average reader, the average consumer, so to speak. Okay, again, he does affluenza, but it's essentially the same thing as what he's doing with pleonexia. Let's go into the final thing. Again, presents a specific name. We have no freaking clue who this dude is. It's false. You can't justify who he is. Like I said, he could be a pseudonym. Can't be justified. Okay, and that's it. I forgot to conclude the evaluation of this, but one can deduce that from all the points we've made, his information is quite ineffective as it presents very heavily biased developed implications and very poor implementation of what he might consider valid as is. What I'm going to do now is just show you a summation of everything. You can look at the names and pause your video just to look at them. So quick note, this is what we're doing here, and then just look at all the evidence and all the annotations if you so please. If not, you're done. Alright, I'm gonna go back down. Alright, and there you go. So thank you for watching, and that's that.